There is fear today of Israel losing its hegemony. And there is a fear that the spirit of resistance from the nations that are against these pliant Western regimes will threaten the whole Western setup for the region. That explains the kind of crazy desperation that we see from the Western side. It's as though someone is losing something. Israel, we know, has been lobbying America for this war for decades. When it failed to get America to fight this war on its behalf, that is when it requested that it begins the war itself, and it sought to drag America in. But I would argue that Israel is the tool in America's hand and not America in Israel's hand. And this is important to understand. America won't be dragged to Israel's square unless it deems that dragging within its own interest.
Hi, and welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan, and my co-host is Fiona Edwards. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. We'll be posting the first 30 minutes here on YouTube, and then you have the full episode on our Patreon for members to watch. So please become a patron on our Patreon. And also, it is available as a podcast on Saturdays on Spotify and Amazon Music, and Patreon, as well as a transcript.
Well, today we're really excited to have an amazing guest join the Global Majority for Peace podcast, who is Batool Subeiti. Batool is an energy engineer and a political analyst based in London. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Oh, awesome. Welcome to the show, Batool. We like to begin each interview on a more of a personal note so guests can get to know you. Could we start with you telling us about the origin of your politicization? Was there a particular incident that has led you to your worldview?
Yes, absolutely. We live in a world with hegemony imposed by the superpowers of our day. That's clear for anyone who actually is interested in observing the world. I live in the UK, so I can't not be aware, for example, of the history of Britain as a unipolar power that colonized a fourth of the world under an empire in which the sun never set, it was said. That power was followed on by America, and we see that today. When it comes to West Asia, also known as the Middle East, again, this is quite a colonial term that describes the region in its relation from the West. I am originally from this region, so I'm South Lebanese from both of my parents. And as you would be aware, the Israeli occupation entity occupied Lebanon for 18 years, up until it was kicked out in 2000. It has tried to reoccupy Lebanon again last year in its all-out war to establish what Netanyahu openly called the quote-unquote new Middle East project that he wanted to actualize this region under Israeli hegemony in its totality. And those were the same words that, again, Condoleezza Rice used in 2006, that the war in Lebanon was it giving a birth pangs for a new Middle East. So this, what I like to call the wrong state of the Israeli occupation entity, is a neighboring entity. Only wrong and evil has come out of it. And in an unprecedented scale today, we're seeing all the human values that the world has ever known, from the UN Charter to the international laws that they're all based on. We're seeing them not only being trampled upon and unaccounted for, but we're seeing them being justified. So these real issues have become like deep scars for me. I mean, my own grandmother's house in Lebanon that I stay in every time I go down, it was bombed in 2006, then it was rebuilt, and then it was bombed again last year in the war. So this is the story of the majority of the Lebanese people that come from the south or come from the Dahir region that you'd hear. And in fact, today we see in Lebanon that they're trying to prevent reconstruction money and aid from going through to further suffocate and to punish its people. So that's just a reality of the world that we live in. Capitalism is the system of the international community, the capitalists in the global north, the billionaires are the ones that are shaping the policies at the expense of the suffering of the masses. This is the world we live in, split between North and South, East and West. Now it's the 99.9% versus the 0.1%. And we're seeing the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And so when we understand these realities, it's really hard to not be politicized, which is why billions are spent in the first place on the mainstream media machine. It's to control that mass opinion. So there is a real censorship that is due to the fear of what will come out from the people's awareness.
Well, that's a great introduction to your politicization, but also the world that we're living in today. I mean, it's sort of like just taking on from what you said, like basically got sort of an agenda shaped by the billionaires, but there's actually billions of people that are opposed to that and want peace and justice. I thought that was a really great way of linking your own personal experience to what's really happening today in a very vivid way. Just moving on to our next question. Beyond the ongoing US-Israeli genocide in Gaza, this year has seen Israel conduct hundreds of attacks on Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and most recently on the 13th of June, Iran. The Western media has claimed it as a 12-day war in which Iran has downplayed the devastation, but the same can be said about the reporting on Iran's defensive strikes on Israel. Can you give us your assessment of the reality of the situation and where everything stands now?
Yes, absolutely. Just on the first part of your question, the reality has again proved exactly what you've mentioned, that the Israeli occupation entity transgresses on all. It can only, in actual fact, survive if the surrounding region is weak. That is why it was so successful in its establishment in 1948 in the first place. And you've also brought the example of Syria. Since December, it's been under Giuliani and the HTS, formally designated as a terrorist group. This was an entity that was celebrated by Netanyahu, and they are very welcoming. So the HTS lot and Giuliani in power is very welcoming of normalizing relations with the Israeli occupation entity. But despite this, despite current Syria not showing any hostility towards Israel, we see that the occupation entity, Israel, did not hesitate to hit all of the Syrian government's military infrastructure and to occupy up to 3 times the landmass of Gaza in Syria. So that's in terms of Syria. That is not in bad terms with the Israeli occupation entity as it currently stands. And you mentioned Lebanon. As we currently see, there has been over 3,000 attacks since the declared ceasefire on the 27th of November, despite the Islamic resistance of Lebanon practicing restraint until this very moment. That is a part of its strategy of recuperating and building itself after the blows in September last year. But also, the Lebanese front doesn't want to tip the internal balance that is hostile because you have a very pro-Western government in power. And the resistance of Lebanon, quite frankly, is not the government. So that's how it's different to, for example, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we know in Lebanon, it was the government that signed the ceasefire with the Israeli occupation entity. So the resistance really right now today in Lebanon is vindicating its position if it were to respond to any Israeli transgressions in the future. And we also have, the West Bank. The strategy today is shredding every last bit of Oslo. The occupation entity wants complete control over the West Bank, despite the PA, the Palestinian Authority in control, that really does its dirty bidding. And if we look at Gaza, we've seen over 600 days, nearly almost 2 years now, of everyday large massacres. Some reports were mentioning that even the Israeli planes ordered by Trump to fly back from Iran, the ammunition that it was carrying were all dropped in Gaza. This is the level of the killing machine that is crushing human life indiscriminately there, like it drinks water. And now if we just quickly move on to Iran, it's a country that did not on any front prove that it went against the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, in producing enriched uranium for military use or for the production of nuclear weapons. That was never proven. We know the fatwa of Ayatollah Sayyid Khamenei, the supreme leader, in prohibiting its production. We know Iran in 2015 was the signatory of the JCPOA. That Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was something that Trump tore in 2018. So that was the negotiations to curb the enrichment to about 3.9%. And recently, Trump claimed that the goal was to halt all uranium enrichment in Iran for civilian purposes, that would be used for civilian purposes. And this is something that flagrantly goes against international law. But not only this, we know that without Trump's greenlighting, the aggression on Iran by the Israeli occupation entity would not have happened. So ultimately, the goal was to destabilize Iran in hopes of achieving regime change. And that would have been done through the assassination of Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei. This was ultimately what Israel had hoped for. And we saw a similar method that was employed on the 13th of June on the aggression in Iran, as was employed in Lebanon in September when the Israeli occupation entity went in. So that is ultimately killing the frontline commanders in hopes of disrupting the command and control. And we saw that the Iranian response to the occupation entity's initial aggression, I would argue it was not in proportion to the fear and the magnitude of aggression. It was less than that aggression that Israel and America used, but it was still very lethal. So in terms of where we are now, when Trump says we destroyed and we crushed and we ended the nuclear project, because he said that a lot and he's used these kind of victory-laden terms, you know that there is a kind of message behind that. That is one that contradicts reality and carries a taste of defeat. Today, Trump doesn't want to hear anything about the Iranian nuclear files anymore because Iran has proven its military might on the ground. And on the other hand, we have Iran declaring that its nuclear facilities were significantly damaged. This is something its Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi had mentioned. And that, in my opinion, also carries a kind of contradictory message when Iran says that, or it over exaggerates in a way the damage. That is a kind of victory in the sense that now you cannot stop us moving forward. We have the pretext to do what suits our own interests, which includes completely withdrawing the IAEA intervention into the Islamic Republic. So America's statements today is reflecting a kind of incapacity. We're seeing a recurring failure from America's side where major goals are set, but they're not being achieved. We saw this in Yemen. Trump declared he would unleash hell, was the words that he used, to end the Yemeni challenge in the Red Sea. But after 7 weeks, we saw Trump actually going out and saying that we're declaring victory against the Yemenis without achieving any of the American goals. So after experiencing and discovering the true power balance on the ground with Iran, a new equation has now kind of been established, and the threshold and the momentum required to start any new war in the future has now risen, perhaps to a level where, nuclear weapons would only be used in the most extreme madness of war under absolute desperation, because conventional weapons against the Islamic Republic of Iran won't work. So this new ceiling presents the West with immense challenges. Either it has to acknowledge the new power balance on the ground, which has now been tested in a way that it never has been before, because if we remember, this is the first time in 40 years that Iran is at war. The last time was during the Iran-Iraq war from 1980 to 1988. So either that's the option, acknowledge the power balance, or America can continue this hostile approach against the Islamic Republic, which has also been proven to be a failure, because after 45 years of sanctions that have backfired and produced this kind of resilience and strength, despite the whole comprehensive embargo, we've seen that the sanctions have failed. And so what's left is recognition and letting go of the Western arrogance and superiority. So now that the regional balance of power has shifted against the Israeli occupation entity that's proven that it cannot defend and save itself against the Iranian hypersonic missiles and doesn't have enough anti-craft missiles and interceptors to help it in this regards. And after its failure to achieve the quote-unquote new Middle East project, that is establishing full domination and monopolization over decisions in the region of West Asia, so that all of its people and all the rulers would become absolute tools and servants to the Israeli policy under Western patronage, we've seen that fail. So yes, to give a balanced assessment, parts of the resistance axis have been weakened. We've seen the threats reach the heart of Iran, which Israel would have never dreamed of. And yes, the resistance axis previously had theoretical excess power, but all of that hadn't been tested up until this point. We've had nearly 2 years of the fiercest confrontations, and after the US and the Israeli occupation entity threw absolutely every single shred of what they have, they threw in all their weight militarily, destructively, and we know that it has 40 years of accumulated intelligence effort, and let's be real, it reigns supreme when it comes to intelligence. That should be enough to overthrow any fragile system. But given the huge disparity in that military strength and the weaponry between the American-Israeli side and the resistance axis, things stand very clear after the test. So I would categorize it as a very foolish, record-breaking period of warfare from the Western side. The Axis appears weaker in its image, but it's proved to be much more stable in terms of its real actual power, which had never been tested before, but now has been.
It just seems like such a huge miscalculation, and especially at a time when there was sort of this really well publicized diplomatic negotiations. I mean, Israel is, I think, in the public sentiment completely has lost, I think, public sentiment. Why do it now? What is the strategy behind striking Iran now, expanding to Iran now? And then also, what is the strategy behind the US directly striking the three nuclear facilities when they had the diplomatic cover of, oh, it's Israel going rogue?
Yes, it's good questions. Here we need to differentiate slightly between the Israeli and the US position. Israel feels existentially threatened by Iran. And this dates back to 1979 when the Islamic Revolution occurred. This revolution was built on the basis that regional Western hegemony needs to be uprooted. And the crux of that is the Israeli occupation entity. Ayatollah Khomeini, Imam Khomeini, went out and famously said that Israel is a cancer that needs to be uprooted. So we also know that Iran materially provided and was the backbone support for the Palestinian resistance on the ground and all the resistances in the region, not just the Islamic resistances, but also the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine prior to that, which is a Marxist group. This explains why Netanyahu comes out and says that the biggest threat to Israel is, this was on a CNN interview, he said it's number one Iran, number two Iran, and number three Iran. So had Iran retreated within its borders and ceased to influence the region's peoples and its active forces, then the issue would have been settled a long time ago, and we wouldn't be in this confrontation in the first place. Israel is trying right now, in every way and shape and form, to shape the region of West Asia the way that it wants, because ultimately this is a reflection of an existential crisis that it is going through. Today, there is, you could say, a big question mark surrounding the very fate of Israel. The security apparatus that all the countries of the region are built on, the Sykes-Picot divides of the last century, those are all threatened with collapse. And there is fear today of Israel losing its hegemony. And there is a fear that the spirit of resistance from the nations that are against these pliant Western regimes will threaten the whole Western setup for the region. That explains the kind of crazy desperation that we see from the Western side. It's as though someone is losing something. Israel, we know, has been lobbying America for this war for decades. When it failed to get America to fight this war on its behalf, that is when it requested that it begins the war itself, and it sought to drag America in. But I would argue that Israel is the tool in America's hand and not America in Israel's hand. And this is important to understand. America won't be dragged to Israel's square unless it deems that dragging within its own interest. So the main goal over here is expanding Israel's size so that it becomes the main regional player within Trump's new regional vision, which is actually a stable region. Trump wants a stable region, acting as the main power. So Israel acts as the main power in the stable region on behalf of the West, and all of America's deals will be pushed through its economic plans. That's what the whole Abraham Accords was about. It was an integrated economic bloc in this region with the Israeli occupation entity at the core of that. And we know that Israel's size within 80% of historic Palestine that it occupied in 1948 is deemed not enough today to play this role, given its sheer and utter failure on the ground, which is why Trump came out in his election spree last year and he said that Israel is so thin it needs fattening up. But as we've been mentioning in this podcast, that this quote unquote new Middle East project, this dream, hasn't been actualized due to Israel's failures. So then one asks the question, why did America allow the green lighting of the Israeli attack on Iran if it's so lethal? Ultimately, we're seeing Israel being used as collateral over here. Like, it was Israel that was bearing the brunt. The only brunt that America bared was 6 missile strikes in the Al Adad base in Qatar, and some reports said also the Ain al Assad base in Iraq, but they had already evacuated all of their main assets. So it was the equivalent of, bombing a runaway, but it's still very symbolically strong that Iran would strike for the second time historically an American base in this region of strategic importance. No other entity or country ever dares to do that. That's tantamount to waging war in America. So America greenlit this Israeli attack on Iran because America itself is interested in measuring the response from Iran's side. Accordingly, they will shape the future of regional confrontations. If Iran's reaction proves decisive, this is in America's mind, then the hit will severely weaken Israel. And this could change the whole political regional landscape. And even American support for Israel in this case will shrink because Israel would have proved itself to be a complete drain, a complete financial drain on America without playing the functional role for which it was created. But on the other hand, if Iran practices restraint, if its response is weak, this gives an indication that the whole of the resistance axis is weak, and Israel in this would emerge much stronger. So America was interested in seeing the credibility of Iran in how it would respond, and it wanted to test that out. And as I mentioned, in all of that, Israel is basically the collateral because it was the one that was sustaining the damage. So really, if America cared about Israeli interests, would it allow it to bear the brunt to this degree? It's almost so suicidal and like shooting itself in the foot. But we know that America, in the first place, just because you mentioned the negotiation files, we know that it opened the negotiations for the nuclear file, not because it's so interested in the nuclear per se, but as Trump himself admitted, the ultimate goal is Iranian submission. That's the whole point. And we know that Iran did not submit in the peak of the negotiations to the what became the zero enrichment imposition by Trump. And we know that Iran was struck in the back. In the middle of these negotiations, that's when the Israeli confrontation occurred under direct American support. So from the Western side, America's using Israel as that collateral to test Iran's capabilities, bearing in mind America, even before Israel, wishes for the Islamic Republic system to fall. That's their ultimate dream. When they failed in this is when we saw America decided to get involved and it hit the 3 nuclear sites. This was also a testing waters to see how effective the American dose really is in capitulating Iran. It was almost like raising the dose a little bit more, seeing if the American side directly intervenes, would Iran capitulate and surrender? But in reality, they're not measuring the real harm because no one can really estimate or measure the real harm that was incurred on these strikes on Iran. When Iran proved that it was willing to go all the way and then hit American assets, that's when they begged for a ceasefire. It was the American and Israeli side that begged for a ceasefire. Otherwise, Iran was happy to continue. And the Western side felt a kind of defeat in changing the system or the policies of the system within the Islamic Republic. They thought they can turn the people against the government. If we remember, that was the primary goal, it's regime change. But the people proved the complete opposite. They rallied behind the government. And so here, when we analyze the Israeli and the American position, we know America wanted a quick hit to succeed. Trump's temperament is one where he lacks patience. He doesn't want a bleeding war, especially after it was shown what Iran's strength was that can harm America and lead to big harm within the Israeli occupation entity that was running out of interceptors that were also extremely costly. So to contextualize it, the request to end the war was critical for Israel and America, despite Israel insisting that Iran remains an existential threat to it, and even more so if it turns into a nuclear power. And today we see, even with Netanyahu's visit to America, it's still lobbying America to inflict a greater harm on Iran and to take Iran outside the realm of influence. So it's still betting on dragging America into a war. The policy of Iran and its influence that refuses Western imposition is something that they ultimately want to crush. That's the main objective behind all of this.
Well, thank you for that very insightful analysis. And I think it's so important that what you're saying around the relationship between Israel and the United States, because there's so many progressive people that actually get it the wrong way around and think that Israel is controlling the United States and the West when it's actually, well, not controlling, but in the end of the day, when it comes down to the final analysis, the US is in charge, and it's, nothing's going to fundamentally happen unless the United States gives it its approval, basically. And that's just shown by how much military aid and economic support is given to Israel. So I think that was just so clearly put. So thank you very much for that. And just on to our next question. A lot has been made recently of Trump famously dropping the F-bomb when Israel broke the ceasefire on the 24th of June. How significant do you think his attitude towards Israel is in terms of sustaining its position? And how much will Trump's own financial interests in the region come into play? Just for context, you wrote in May that his trip to the Middle East concluded in an estimated $3 to $4 trillion worth of investments, primarily pledged from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE.
Yes. So the intersection of interests between the Israeli occupation entity and Trump differs from the primary intersection that we see between the American deep state and the Israeli occupation entity, because it's important to acknowledge the difference between the American deep state's position and Trump in generally speaking. Trump, as you've mentioned, is a man of bargains and trade. Here, financial interests really come into play and are important to him. So from his perspective, Israel is just like this military base that was turned into a country that's supposed to be serving our interests on the ground. But what happens when it turns from this asset that's a striking, effective force on the ground into a liability? Trump plays that kind of financial game where he weighs the wins and the losses. Trump is a man who would be unconditional towards the Israeli occupation entity and absolutely give it the free hand. I mean, he doesn't even believe in this concept of the two-state solution that the deep state has been championing. But all of this really depends on Israel proving itself capable. It's like if you want to annex the West Bank, if you want to completely annex and occupy Gaza, fine. Like, I'll allow you to reoccupy Gaza. You know, those 5 no's that I remember Blinken came out in 2023 and was stating, you know, no reoccupation of Gaza, no resettlement of Gaza. The 5 no's, Trump wouldn't agree with that. Trump would give Israel the free hand. But there's a caveat. Israel has to be capable and able on the ground. But we've seen at 21 months on, 350 square kilometers of Gaza, and they still haven't, you know, as Netanyahu has mentioned, finished the job. You know, this was something that he said today. We still need to finish the job, i.e., not only massacre the hell out of the Palestinians and maximize the genocide, but also defeat the Gazan resistance. On the level of the competing interests and influence of Israel, you know, this all depends on ability. If we consider its creation in 1948, where it captured 80% of historic Palestine, in those boundaries, today, Israel is unable to carry out the functional role with which it was created. And that was to act as a striking stick on behalf of the Western superpower of the day. So that was previously Britain, and today that's America. And to ensure that the whole region of West Asia, this really important region, is completely pliant under the Western strategy. And so Israel, as a small entity in a hostile region that is not welcoming of it, that rejects normalization, that's in terms of the people of the region. This entity took advantage of October the 7th to expand the quote unquote new Middle East plan. This was something that Netanyahu spoke before literally a month in September 2023 at the UN. And that is to basically strike the resistance fronts and to defeat them in all those countries. But what happens when it fails in undoing all of these resistance parties? And as you've exactly rightly mentioned before, Israel cannot breathe without the American oxygen. All its weaponry comes from America. America itself, we know, failed in Yemen after 7 weeks of its absolute bombing spree. And so here the power of Israel in playing a functional role has become limited because in the face of the real forces on the ground, it has been tried and tested and it's been a failure. And we know that it was created. It's not got inherent strength. It is the weakness of the surroundings that allowed it to establish itself, and for all those decades as well. And we know also that Iran has been tested, and it's become very clear that it is impossible to eliminate in its current form, in its current structure and direction. And with the inherent power that it possesses, at the regional level, we know Iran's influence and its relations with the resistance forces that share the same orientation and goals for regional security, rejecting foreign interventions. That still remains very strong, whether it's with Lebanon, whether it's with Yemen, of course, the resistance factions in Palestine, also Iraq. So Iran did not break on any front. And now it is feared more than before and respected also more than before because it's proved its strength and because of its proven resilience as well. So now what remains is the true power that I would argue, if we give it time to rebuild itself during peacetime, the region will ultimately shift into a new phase, one in which the resistance forces have the upper hand and the final word, because the real forces on the ground inevitably end up imposing itself when we know maps get carved out of wars. And so the Israeli occupation entity today is existentially threatened. It is no longer a safe haven for its settlers. It carries too many contradictions. It's been proven unable. And this will lead the superpowers inevitably, if they care about their interests really, to find substitutes for this functional role. But that's, of course, not easy because you've got a very complicated region. You've got these Persian Gulf countries that you've mentioned that are not harmonious per se with the Western strategy. They're pliant and they're compliant, but not very harmonious. So Israel is active, but the problem the West has with Israel is that it's failing. The other Arab regimes are just there for America to milk, especially someone like Trump. He'll come and he'll milk Saudi and he'll milk Qatar and the UAE, but they don't have the capacity per se to generate investments and to provide services to sit in place of the Israeli occupation entity. So here, ultimately, the critical question becomes, can Israel and behind it the US adapt to and deal with this new reality that's not in their favor? I don't think they will be able to tolerate it for very long. Out of recklessness and impatience to impose their exclusive will in the region, these foolish actions may lead to another confrontation. That's something that we cannot rule out. They will test the waters and try to enter into a confrontation gradually, like they're doing in Lebanon. And this might lead at the level of dealings with the Islamic Republic, because the Islamic Republic of Iran is no Lebanon, to a much larger confrontation. So something unforeseen by the US and the Israeli occupation entity might occur due to Israel's inability to endure this kind of confrontation. As I mentioned, Israel today is existentially threatened. And this could ultimately lead to its very demise, because Iran has emerged much stronger and it must boldly present its vision for the region in all its components of the resistance, and it has proven to do so.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.